Hello and welcome back to our study in the book of James. We are now into James chapter 4. We have previously looked at the first 10 verses in this chapter, and we have addressed worldliness in the church. And James has spoken about causes of conflict, unanswered prayer, God versus the world, so to speak, the wisdom of God and the wisdom from below. Talked about submission and triumphant joy or victory. And now we're in James chapter 4, moving into verse 11, and James begins talking about evil speaking, and it is condemned. In verse 11, he says, "Do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge." And James here he returns to things involving the tongue. It seems that this was as much an issue then as it is today, and the original language means to stop doing it. The evil speaking here being that which was slanderous against a brother, and therefore not showing love for one another. When one criticizes or speaks negatively of their brethren, they're showing a lack of love. And this lack of love expresses itself in harsh words and undue criticism. Oftentimes, we are prone to spread that which is bad or negative about another rather than that which is good. It seems bad news always travels faster. It seems gossip is always more entertaining. But a simple truth is that in order for there to be evil speakers, that there must be evil hearers. And while people may enjoy slandering one another, and they may enjoy listening to this type of gossip and such things, and we're tempted to spread it, but we have to realize that there is no joy in this, that there is no good that comes out of it in receiving it or in telling it. In the Psalms, David asked a question in Psalm 15 and verse 1. He says, "Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill?" And this is answered in his own question in verses 2 and 3. It says, "He who walks uprightly and works righteousness, and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend." James then speaks of such a brother who would speak evil, as speaking evil of the law and judging it. The law here is not the law of Moses, as we've moved beyond that. James is speaking to Christians. And then the law here being that law of liberty, that perfect law, and it is the law of Christ. The law of Christ being his teachings. It would include his moral judgments as well. Among such, there is a law of love. Love one another, appearing 12 times in the New King James Version of the New Testament. To speak evil of another thereby goes against Jesus' law to love. And by speaking evil of another, one speaks evil then of the law, judging the law to not be worthy of good and as something to be disregarded. This ties in with previous verse of not humbling oneself to the Lord's commands. Such a person is placing themselves in a place of knowing better than God and is abandoning the law rather than being a doer of such. Now, the judging here that James is speaking of is that which forms a hasty opinion without fact, that only serves the evil speaker, that they're out of malice they're doing this, and it violates the law of love. Now, as Christians, we are to obey the law, not to violate it. And to try and to try to judge whether it is good or bad is not within us. However, if somebody is in trespass of the law, and we who are spiritual, Galatians 6:1, see a brother in trespass and we don't turn them back, then we have violated the law. And neither are we showing love if we do not correct a brother in error. And so we have to be careful when we talk about judging. As we talked about in a previous lesson on a Sunday night worship, if you've been watching on YouTube and on Facebook, but Ephesians 4 and verse 11 speaks about speaking the truth in love. And sometimes the truth hurts. but we do it out of love to correct an erring brother. Now, this is not the same as what James is talking about here. This is undue, harsh, seeking malice toward another. And we cannot say we love God and respect His Word and then violate it. What James has in view here is the continual practice of such behavior. And James tells us that such speaking should not even begin in us, as what is occasional affects our character. It leads to a habit of doing such continuously. It's impossible to then be in a right relationship with God if not in the proper relationship with our brethren. And we think about James talking about prayer and unanswered prayer. Well, why is sometimes our prayer unanswered? Because we're not in the right relationship with God, because we're not in the right relationship with our brethren. Now, it is possible to then be in a right relationship with God and not in a proper relationship with our brother. That is impossible. For John tells us in 1 John 2, verses 10 and 11, he who loves his brother abides in the light, and there is no cause of stumbling in him. But he who hates his brother is in darkness and walks in darkness, and does not know where he is going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. John would also tell us, how can we love God whom we have not seen if we don't love our brother who we have seen? And so, again, when we look to judging, we have to keep in the proper context the scope of judging and what is an unrighteous judgment or a harsh judgment versus what is the judgment needed in concern and care for our brethren to correct them in an error. And so we must exercise love in both these aspects. In verse 12, he begins to talk about judgment belonging to another. He says, there is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge another? Again, we have to keep in context the type of judging we're talking about. And now in the Old Testament, Moses delivered the law to the people, but he also said in Deuteronomy in 18 verse 15, it's recorded, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren, him you shall hear. The Jews understood that there would be the coming of another lawgiver. When John the Baptist was asked if he was the prophet, he answered no in John 1, and we see this in verses 20 and 21. When Jesus, being asked about his credentials as the Christ, in John 5, verses 46 and 47, he said, for if you believed Moses, you would believe me. For he wrote about me, but if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? We see that Jesus was that prophet that Moses said was coming. He was going to be the new lawgiver, and so we have moved into this law of Christ. And then on the Mount of Transfiguration, when Moses was present, a voice called down, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. Matthew 17, verse 5. And while there is only one lawgiver, that being God, his law was delivered. We see Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2, that in time past the fathers by the prophets has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things. In John 1 and verse 17 it says, for the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now this doesn't mean that we're not without any law at all, but we are in that law of Christ. That is a higher standard. The old law constantly pointed to sin and brought out the nature of sin, but it was a yearly atonement constantly for sin. Hebrew writer makes clear when Jesus died that he was better than that of the blood of bulls and goats, that he died once for all, and he no longer needs to make a yearly sacrifice. He is that prophet that was foretold. And it is Jesus who has all authority. We see this in Matthew 28 and verse 18. All authority has been given to him. Jesus is also, as the authority, the head of the church. Ephesians 1 and verse 22, Ephesians 5 verse 23, Colossians 1 verse 18, he is the head of the church, which is the body. Ephesians 4 and verse 4 also telling us that there is one body. If there is one body and Jesus is the head of it, and the body is the church, then he is the head of the church. This is also why we take the New Testament as our only authority. And we don't have man-made creeds, synods, councils, or an earthly headquarters, or at least we should not have these things, as Christ is the only head. as it is Jesus who has all authority, and it is his word that will judge us in the last day. John 12 and verse 48, the words he has spoken will judge us in the last day. Who are we then to make judgment on what he has said? Now, again, the judgment we're talking about is not like when we see a brother who is in error. We think of Galatians 6. We think of Romans 16. If we see somebody who is not in the doctrine, who's not abiding by the word of Christ, which is our law, we as Christians, as followers of Christ, it is our duty to point out to an erring brother where they have failed. Now, this type of judgment is what we would read is righteous judgment. Sadly, many look to Matthew 7, verse 1, judge not lest you be judged, and they stop reading, not realizing he goes on to speak about not giving what is holy to dogs, what is not to cast your pearls before swine. He warns of a wide and narrow road. He speaks of false teachers. You see, these require a judgment. Even Galatians 6, verse 1. Brother, if you who are spiritual see a brother in a trespass, restore such a one. That requires a judgment. And so the judgment we're talking about is not that we're judging that what Jesus has said to be wrong and we're questioning what he has said. We have to realize the type of judgment that we are speaking of. Now, again, as Jesus has all authority, Matthew 10, verse 28 says, and do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Now, this is typically understood to refer to God, but later in the same gospel, Jesus says that he would be the one who would save or destroy, as he would sit on the throne of his glory, in Matthew 25, verse 31, where all nations were gathered to be separated, left and right. We see the deity of Christ as well as James's understanding of Jesus and his teachings. Paul would even tell us in 2 Corinthians 5:10, for we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. See, all authority has been given to him, and it is he who will judge us in the last day. Again, the judgment we're talking about here, Jesus, he is the one who will separate those to his left and right that will either hear, well done, good and faithful servant, or depart from me, I never knew you. But we are to judge in certain matters. Again, the judging that condemns, that is negative, that is unhelpful, that is lacking in love, as it judges God and his law, that is not what we are to be about. Then we are no longer a doer, but a judge. But to look at a brother and be able to look to the law, the word of God, and see this brother is not walking according to the doctrine, and to say out of love, in fact, in Matthew 15, it even talks about if we have a problem with our brother, we go to our brother. If that doesn't work, we take 2 or 3 with us. If that doesn't work, we bring it before the whole congregation. And not only is this if we have an issue between our brother, but if we see somebody who is walking out of line, Ezekiel 18 talks about the watchman. If we see somebody who is not walking according to the doctrine, somebody who is an obvious sin, and we say nothing, well, then we're guilty as well. Romans chapter 1 speaks of some that did not hold the knowledge of God and their understanding. God gave them up to vile passions. But when we get to Romans 1 and verse 32, we see it pointed out that not only were they guilty, but those who condoned such action were guilty. And when we see a brother in error and we say nothing, we are giving our silent consent to what they're doing, and we become guilty of sin as well. And then we see here this word destroy that we speak about. In this passage, it means to destroy fully, to perish, to lose, to die. And that the law is from Jesus, and therefore the final judgment is strictly reserved for the Lord. For us to exercise harsh judgments against our brethren, it usurps the role of Jesus, to which James begs the question, who are you to judge another? In verses 13 and 14, he now speaks about presumptuous confidence. Verse 13, he says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, and buy and sell and make a profit. And James is focusing here, he's on the foolish presumptions that we make. Presumption in this verse is one that we will do well. Now, those that he's speaking of, we're going to go here, we're going to do well. How often Man has the idea that bad things will never happen to me. For James here, he speaks of those these are the ones who have disregarded God in their planning. While there's nothing wrong in planning for the future, let us examine this passage. First, there's nothing to indicate that this is an actual quote of someone, but merely that James is addressing an attitude that many hold. The presumption begins with that the timing of our going is up to us, as though nothing can affect it. Health, weather, so on. My wife and I, we had plans to go on vacation here this past month in April. And of course, as you know, we have this coronavirus, this COVID-19. Well, um, our plans were, of course, changed. We no longer were able to go on vacation. That where we will go will also be of our choosing, as though transportation is guaranteed. Nothing will hinder our travel. We had plans to go to California to visit the granddaughters. Well, guess what? Airlines started canceling flights. It wasn't up to us. That the time spent there is not dependent upon lodgings being available. That no war, famine, or plague may break out. See, well, these are all things that we have to take into consideration. I went to Guyana the beginning of this year. I left just in time because then they had some political uprising, some violence going on, and of course then the coronavirus. And so, they need to take these things into consideration. It says we will trade. Takes no consideration of whether or not our goods will be available or even wanted. That there will be no shortage. Nothing will occur to affect our ability to trade. No damaged or stolen goods. Nothing will hinder our trade, city regulations, labor disputes, etc. There we will make a profit. That, of course, buyers and merchandise will be plentiful and the profits will just roll in. You see all these presumptions? There's nothing wrong in and of itself here. The problem is taking it for granted and in failing to consider God in all of their planning. Such an attitude of relying on oneself and not trusting in God, it's considering God, it's not, or not considering God in our planning is what is being condemned, and is another way in which we can be prideful. And though this chapter of James, he's spoken of presumptuous disregard of God and His way, the people choosing the world in preference of God, verses 1 through 10. We see contempt of the law, verses 11 and 12. And now, confidence with reference to the future. We are without assurance of what will happen the next minute, let alone tomorrow or a few years from now. Jesus' parable of the rich fool in Luke 12. We can clearly see what James probably had in mind, and where this rich fool, he trusted in himself and that he would enjoy all that he had. Yet in Luke 12 and verse 20 it says, "Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will all those things be which you have provided?" I have a friend of mine who always says, we accumulate all these things, and when we die, our children are going to sell them at a yard sale for a quarter. Solomon makes the point in Ecclesiastes, we reap all these things, we store them up, and yet when we die, they belong to somebody else. It's vanity. And so Proverbs 27 verse 1 also, it tells us, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth." Many changes can happen in 24 hours. Now in verse 14, James moves on. He says, "Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away." Many have the attitude, it's never going to happen to me. But all of a sudden, our life can be drastically changed forever due to an accident, due to illness. It can even be taken away. 2017, I was diagnosed with cancer. I remember laying in the hospital that first night, having been told, and you have those feelings of why me, and it couldn't never happen to me. They have to be wrong, but these things happen in life because we've sinned. Sin and death have entered the world, and with it, illness, disease, natural disasters. Jesus also spoke of the uncertainty of life. In Matthew 6 and verse 30, during the Sermon on the Mount, he says of the grass, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the oven. Matthew 6 verse 30. Also, Peter, in 1 Peter 1, verse 24, he makes a similar analogy. He says, all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of the grass. The grass withers, and its flower falls away. James here describes our life like a vapor. Now, how fitting a description when one thinks of a fog rolling across the earth in the early morning, and it can be miles long, but it's soon gone as the sun rises and dispels it. Job, when we read Job 7, verses 7 through 9, he says, oh, remember that my life is a breath. The eye of him who sees me will see me no more. While your eyes are upon me, I shall no longer be. As the cloud disappears and vanishes away, so he who goes down to the grave does not come up. Regardless of what one plans to do, right or wrong, it cannot be done if we're not alive. And therefore it is foolish for us, while planning for the future, not to consider God in all of our planning. How many of us work, budget, we plan for vacation, ultimately retirement, but do we consider God in our plans? Sadly, we put more effort and time into work and not into the things that are important, such as family and God. Some have taken this passage to mean that James was speaking of those living ungodly lives and pointing out the emptiness and the futility of such. However, this is true of all. And what is being addressed is giving no regard for God and the maintenance of our lives and the character of it. And this is, those that are Christians and those that are non-Christians, both can be equally as guilty as this. In verses 15 through 16, James now moves into recognizing God in our affairs. He says in verse 15, instead, now this is opposed to those who are making presumptuous judgments. He says, instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. In time past, God operated in the lives of men directly. He no longer does that today. Rather, today, he operates in our lives through the written word as we come to understand it and to obey it, sometimes through providence, which we will never know in our lifetime. I know with my cancer, certain things came about with doctors and hospitals and surgeries that were needed and dealing with insurance. And we prayed and we prayed and we prayed and things fell into place. I believe that God was working, that there was God's providence in that. But I can't come out and say that, miraculously God took care of everything and he answered my prayers, although we know that God does answer prayers. And so I think one of my favorite verses comes from the book of Esther, and Mordecai talks about her being there as queen, and she's in a place and at a time that she can speak to the king and to save her people. And Mordecai he's never presumptuous to say, God put you here for this reason. He says, perhaps you've come here this time in this place for this very reason. And so we have to understand that God does work through providence. Sometimes things happen as a result of natural course, but God has a hand in it somewhere. That's how God answers prayer. No longer does he miraculously move in our lives as he did in the Old Testament. We need not take James' writing here today solely as some providential act, but as he is addressing what he just wrote in verse 13, to remember God in all of our affairs. The original language also bearing the meaning of considering God in all of our acts of planning, and that we do so with a proper attitude to do so in a manner that is pleasing to God. We have to, as we're planning, not only consider what may befall in the future, what would be pleasing to God as well. This also means that all things must be done keeping with what God wills, and therefore we must sometimes lay aside what we will to do. Many years ago, I needed a job, and the only job that was offered to me was working in a distillery, driving a forklift, putting boxes of rum onto a truck. And I thought about it and thought about it. And as a Christian, I just, in good conscience, I could not accept that job. And so I had to consider God in my planning. We need to remember two things in all of our plans. First, if the Lord wills, meaning, is it in keeping with his will? Is it something that has been revealed to us in the pages of the New Testament? Is there teaching on it that can lead us into making a sound judgment? Second, will we be alive to do it? As there is no guarantees beyond the moment that we are in. And so Are we doing all that's right with God first and foremost? Remember, we're to put the kingdom of God first. We are to deny self and follow Christ. The expression of the Lord wills, it seems to be solely a New Testament expression, possibly due to the fact that God was soon no longer going to operate in our lives miraculously any longer. And so we had to take into consideration, well, I hate to use this phrase here, but what would Jesus do? And we have to ask ourselves, what is in the will of the Lord? With the miraculous ending, as Paul would talk about in 1 Corinthians 13, those things were coming to an end. We then need to be mindful then of the written word. The same expression is found in various other New Testament passages. In Acts 18 and verse 21, Acts 21 verse 14. Paul, as we mentioned, 1 Corinthians 4 verse 19, he also speaks of it. 1 Corinthians 16:7, and the Hebrew writer as well in chapter 6 and verse 3. Now, James says in verse 16, but now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. James does not mean to say that all boasting or rejoicing is bad, as some is acceptable and good, compared with 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 19, but that which takes pleasure in leaving God out, that kind of boasting, that's evil. Now, what James speaks of is not just a lack of consideration for God, but of consciously not regarding God in any of our planning and making plans purely on our own wisdom. Consider what we saw in verse 13. The lack of regard for God in their planning and assuming they could do whatever they wanted when they wanted. When we fail to consider God in our plans, that is perhaps why our plans fail, and it is certainly sinful. It is severely presumptuous to believe that we do not need to consider God in our lives and in our plans and in our decisions. Now, the word translated as arrogance or boastings, if you have the King James, it means empty boasting, self-confidence, pride. And it is even translated as pride in 1 John 2 and verse 16 when we read, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. Now in verse 17, James now speaks about the sin of omission. It says, therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. To do good has a direct relation to what James has stated in the previous verses, but like so many passages of Scripture, the principle extends far wider. When we realize God's will for us, the fleeting nature of life, refuse to acknowledge God in our lives, maybe even boasting in ourselves, and we fail to do what is right, we're guilty of sin. Once again, Jesus' teachings can be seen in James. In Matthew 23 and verse 23, Jesus criticized the Pharisees for keeping some of the law, while neglecting, he says, the weightier matters of the law. Jesus' purpose was to show that sins of omission were just as sinful as sins of commission. We have to be careful. There's a thing, I believe it was a squabble, I can't remember exactly now, but if you tell the truth, but you leave out parts of the truth with the intent to deceive, it's still a lie. There is a false doctrine of probabilism also. This is, if one is in doubt that a certain commandment is applicable to oneself, they may follow their own mind or their own will. Now, this false belief seeks to find some way around what one knows they should do by trying to ignore or downplay what it is they actually know. Those with this view then try to seek some source that supports their error and hopes of then justifying their sins. And sadly, we can look, if we have a false view, if we have a certain sin that we are in and we don't want to give up that sin, we can surely find somebody who will support our view, our notion, and make us feel comfortable in living that lie. There seems to be some relation here also to Paul's words to the church in Rome. In Romans 14 and verse 23, in that second part of the verse, it says, whatever is not from faith is sin. When one has knowledge of what is right, it creates then in them an obligation of doing right. If one is in doubt if an act is right, then we must abstain from it. until we have further studied and discovered whether it is right or wrong. Therefore, we sin when we do not do what we know we should be doing, or we do what we know is wrong, and if we have any doubt about it. If we have any doubting, then it is sin to us. Still today, in the church, there are many guilty of sins of omission. We hear the word, we know what it says, but we fail to do it. We forget that there is a need not only for abstinence from evil, but a need to do good. In the day of judgment, we will not be judged solely on what we have not done, but also on what we have done. Once again, James shows an understanding of Jesus' teachings as we consider all the judgment parables of the Lord. Each punishment was not meted out for something bad done by the individual, but by something good they failed to do. What makes one a wicked person in God's eyes is not always doing evil, but the failure to do good. We judge people, and as James speaks about, using discretion and care in judgment. But we judge sometimes solely by appearance, and we even are warned about that, to judge with righteous judgment. God even speaking that he looks at the inward man, not the outward. And so we must be careful in our judging. Not all judging is wrong, but that judging that is solely for the sake of condemning another, to seek some type of evil on them, to look down upon them, that is not what we are called to do. Remember, God loves you, and so do I. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you again.